Well, welcome everybody. It's good to be here, and it's good to be here with our very, very good panelists. I'm really much looking forward to this conversation. I know a lot of the times we're talking about economics, and we're talking about productivity and things like that. Today we're going to be talking about demographics, family policy, childcare policy, and a bunch of other things. And I think that there's a tendency in Canadian public policy debate to consider issues of the home, which is the sort of center of all the things that we're going to be talking about today, or marriage or fertility. We tend to think of it in one of three ways. One, we think of it as a purely private concern. The government doesn't really do anything, shouldn't really do anything related to home, fertility, marriage, that type of stuff. It's private, just leave it alone. We don't want the government talking about it, don't want the government interfering at all. So that's one. Number two is that when it does come up in public policy debate, it's seen as a niche concern for SOCONs or the new vitalists who really just want to return us to a past era where, things were really good and women were barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. So that's the second one, that there's a niche concern. And the third one is that it often appears as a niche concern for radical feminists, who are in some ways the mirror image of those who are in the sort of more a vitalist sort of movement. And they want to remake society so that women are liberated of the demands of motherhood or home or other things that the patriarchy has defined as being associated with women. What I find fascinating about all of these approaches, especially when they're translated into public policy, is not just that they're wrong, but that they often totally ignore what the data say on what women actually want themselves. They don't really talk to women who have desires and want those things. So we see stats in Canada which show that Canadian fertility is at roughly 1.3, which is its lowest rate ever recorded. We see a national childcare program in which tens of billions of dollars and a host of regulation is being used to support the 30% of families that use that particular type of childcare, while zero support is given to the 60% of families that have other options, and particularly the working class families that have unique needs that aren't served at all by these tens of billions of dollars. And we see a massive rise in people living what Andrew would call la vida lonely. Single-person households are at an all-time high in Canada. They're about 30%. Marriage rates are at an all-time low. And young Canadians between the ages of 18 and 34 are living alone, and their number has more than doubled. And people will look at these stats and they'll say, well, that's just what people want. That's just the sort of natural consequence of what people want. But if you look at actual further stats, you'll see that the desire for marriage remains extremely high, above 70%. The desire for children remains high. And in the case of fertility, a study that we did, that Andrea and others did at Carta, show that women actually want to have more children. They want to have about 0.5 more, which is significant, which would move us from 1.3 to 1.8, which is very close. But they don't. They don't have that. And that the reason for that gap does not appear to be one of choice, but one of sort of cultural pressures and economic pressures and otherwise. So something more is going on here. It's not simply a fact that people are getting what they want. There appears to be a gap between what people want, what women want in particular, and what's being offered by the policy environment. So to help us understand these questions, we have three, I think, of the most interesting voices in public policy on these matters. And I would say that none of them fit into any of the categories I've just described above. And they're going to help us describe a better approach to policy which focuses on the actual desires of women and policy that will focus on achieving those needs and those desires. So I'm going to start from left to right. Right here we have Paige McPherson. Paige is the Director of Education Policy at Fraser Institute, does great work, provides great data, writes great commentary. You can find her all over the places in newspapers, radio stations, and so on. Next to her we have Ginny Roth. You can wait till the end and we can all clap at the end. Next we have Ginny Roth, who's a partner at Crestview, and she's also one of the pointy-headed intellectuals who writes at The Hub and other places. So you can see her on TV and you can read her articles. And then last but not least, we have my colleague at Cardis, senior fellow at Cardis, Andrea Mrozek, who has over a decade of experience in public policy on marriage, family, fertility, and all these other things. She's great. You can find her work at cardis.ca. So thanks so much. So my job here is just to lob a question and then just step out of the way. So the first question I want to ask is, we talk about home, we talk about these things, marriage, fertility. Why does this matter as a public policy matter? Why does it matter? Is it something that we should even be talking about? And if so, why? So I'm going to start with you, Paige. Take it away.
So I think that, in a choice-maximizing environment, which is something that I think on both the left and the right, there's a lot of talk about we want to empower women to have the choices, to be able to make the choices that they want to make for their lives. We want to empower families to be able to make the choices that they want for their lives. And even the, I think, loudest advocates of government largesse, of programs like government daycare or, expansive government schooling, they will always say, oh, but you can always choose something different. Even if we're not making that, we're not taking tax dollars and putting that into that option, you always have the choice. But I think what the important question is in our current policy environment in Canada, do families and women actually have these choices, or how feasible or realistic are these choices for families to make? So, I think that's really the important question when it comes to, assessing the public policy side of things. So we've got fully funded government schools throughout the country, and of course, we've got 5 provinces that have policies that enable some kind of educational choice, allowing some tax dollars to follow kids to the schools of their choice, if they're independent schools, or maybe in some cases homeschooling. And then we've got 5 provinces that don't have those options. But again, even people who are kind of on the bigger government side of the equation will still say, oh, but you can send your kid to an independent school. You can always make that choice. It's the same sort of in the context of our big, now expansive childcare program. We've got heavily subsidized daycare option. But of course, you don't have to send your child to a $10 a day daycare center that's heavily regulated by the government. You can always choose to stay home with your kids. You can always choose to have grandma quit her job and stay home with the kids, or go to a private day home. But in the context of how these policies are actually shaking out, paired with the cost of living and the cost of the tax burden in Canada, how feasible are those choices for families with increasing wait lists as a result of the expansive government daycare rollout, increasing costs of these programs? How realistic is it for families to make those choices? So I think that's, the important public policy question. We can probably get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty on what those numbers actually are.
Ginny, I'd love you to sort of follow up on that. Is a lot of people will sort of say, okay, well, look, this, again, saying to Paige, it's sort of people's choice. We don't really want to interfere in the home, and it shouldn't really be a public policy issue. We don't want to talk about it. What would your response to that be?
Well, first of all, I think if you paint a picture for people about a low birth rate future, a picture of Canada, the projections are such that you get there quicker than you might think. And I think most people find it repugnant. Like, when you hear, I think it was Japan got to a point where they said there were more adult diapers sold than baby diapers. People just find that, I think, they recoil at the thought, because we all have an innate desire for a vital society. And we all, I think, inherently value the family as an institution, even if we make individual choices about how to live our lives and periods where we live alone and that sort of thing. And so if you accept that that's true, that people feel that way, you kind of have to work back from that. And the challenge with demographics and birth rates and the culture that results from those trends is it happens slowly. And that is the path that we're on. There's no question. People don't spend a lot of time talking about it because it's a really tough problem to solve, and I'm not going to pretend that there are easy answers. But no one wants us to get there. I don't think anyone wants that for society. So so that's the first piece. And then even if you believe that the state should be neutral on these matters, and that if people want that, if you enable choice, then people will choose that life for themselves. Well, the state's not neutral. And in many, many ways, the state is not neutral. We have curriculums in schools that's not neutral. We have digital and social media environments that we all operate in now, particularly young people, in a way that many of us didn't when we were young, and that has an impact. We have a cost of living crisis that is the result of decisions that various levels of government have made. And so the state's not neutral at all. even if you were to sort of get back to a baseline to try to enable people to make choices, I think you'd have better outcomes. And then I think in addition to that, if you can layer in a kind of conservative culture on top of a neutral state, you can have impact. There's all kinds of research, much of it sponsored by Cardis, that tells us a bit about about the gap between the desired number of children that any one woman wants to have and them not meeting that. And it's complicated, it's difficult, but you can get at some of the challenges. There's this culture of intensive parenting and what we all expect of parenting in this day and age in wealthy Western societies. There is a cost component. There are all sorts of things that we can do. And of course, legislators make these choices all day, every day. And so I think we ought to have a perspective on that if we care about that outcome.
Andrea, what would your response to that question be?
Yeah, I'm going to pull out the big guns and quote Nobel laureate economist James Heckman, who said the family is the whole story. We don't want to talk about the family, he adds, but the family is the whole story. And it is the whole story about a lot of economic and social issues. And so agreed with what Paige and Ginny have just said. Now is not the time to be taking family for granted. We're not in a position of just being able to assume some of the things that have happened in the past are going to happen in the future, because they frankly aren't. Declining fertility, declining marriage, increased authority. There's a power imbalance that is ever growing in the wrong direction. And the state is decidedly not neutral right now. And in fact, one easy, we'll get into solutions later, I'm sure, but moving towards neutrality, just even taking a tiny step in that direction, would be a great boon for families today, instead of foisting ever more programs, however well-meaning, that do not reach families where they're at, and in fact, do not empower parents, take power away from parents, and put it in the hands of other people who don't know your kid and don't know your family desires.
That's a response I'd love to hear.
We are doing a lot right now. I would say also the state, in not being neutral, is doing quite a bit, and some of it's good. I like the Canada Child Benefit. I like parental leave plans, needs to be improved, in my opinion, but there's so many bad attempts to help being added to those. So it's not as if we're not talking about family. I think we are, but a lot of the attempts to help are heading in the wrong direction.
Okay, so I'm gonna sort of ask you, and then I'll come back around the other way. When in policy, most people are like, okay, well, what's the problem? It's got to be economic. The reason we're not having enough kids is it's got to be economic. We've got to give more money, or what have you. You talked about the Canadian Child Benefit, and it's done lots and lots of great things. But what is driving? What is driving these decisions? What are driving these choices? Is it economics? Is it culture? And what role does policy have to play if it's a mix of both? So maybe, Andrea, I'll start with you.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that question?
It's always all of those things, so I'm not going to stake very firm ground in one direction, but I am a person who thinks that these trends are largely cultural. You go rewind in history, since the 60s, the 70s, we've been on this trajectory. Economic factors have partnered with other factors. It can be things like mobility, people moving for jobs all the time, that decreases family roots and family stability, the kind of community you need to take care of your kids. We have this sense that we're wealthy, we don't really need help. It's kind of only in having a kid that you realize how untrue that is, that you immediately need tons of support, even if you only have one child. I've deluded myself on that tons of times. I would have, I was the mom in the labor delivery room with my email and thinking that was just going to continue exactly the way it had. It's ridiculous, but I think our culture allowed me to believe that pre-having a kid would look exactly the same as after, just there'd be a child present who would, enter the family photos. That's a cultural problem. The fact that I had never held a baby prior to basically having nieces in my life, but certainly mostly my own child, that's another cultural problem. When you work in downtown Toronto and you never see children, the office towers, the life of a mom doing wage work is harried at best, I think, and so people are scurrying home and not talking about the fact that family life is the most important thing to them. These are cultural problems. Then the state comes in and says, now we're going to facilitate your wage work. We want mothers of young children to be working more. We want your taxes. And we're going to make programs that facilitate that. That's a lack of state neutrality partnering with a cultural trend. Yeah. Could go on and on.
Yeah. Paige, I'm going to turn to you next. because you work with Fraser. Fraser does some of the best work, I think, on getting economic stats out there, and doesn't tell the whole story. But if you think about what the economy is, it comes from the Greek word oikos, which is the home. So obviously the economy has something to do with this. So maybe can you talk to us about, what role does the economy have? And there's some influence, so help us understand that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's the economy and then there's the policy design. I think that, building on what I said before, the government makes it very difficult to choose the non-government avenue for schooling, for childcare, or even for making choices around how many kids you want to have, for example. And then when you pair that with the economy, the cost of living, it becomes even more difficult. So you can choose to have as many kids as you want. Sure, you might not be able to afford a house to put them in, but you can still make the choice to have as many kids as you want. Sure, you might not be able to have one of you financially be able to stay home and help raise those children, but you can certainly make that choice if you'd like to. Now, we have this $10 a day daycare option if you want to get right back to work. So that might be, you're probably making more than $10 a day in your job, so that then becomes the easier choice for a lot of families to make. Now, of course, some of this is cultural, that's undeniable. It's about what we prioritize as families. That's a huge aspect of it. But it is that, there is an oppressively large government that is very expensive. And when paired with the cost of living, it's no secret that the cost of groceries are through the roof. I have 3 kids. Our grocery bill is enormous. It's undeniable. And then when you look at, for example, just a few factors, the size of government is up, the size of debt, or the cost of debt interest payments, provincially, federally. The federal per person spending is at a record high. These kinds of government choices that they're making on fiscal and economic policy have impacts on families who then have to pay those taxes. Because our Fraser Institute research shows that now the average Canadian family now spends more of its income on taxes, 45.3%, than it does on the basic necessities of life, which is food, shelter, and clothing combined. And as I've just mentioned, the cost of all of those necessities is going way up, and yet we're still spending more on taxes. So that's 35.6% on the basic necessities, 45% on taxes. What's left after that? So sure, you can send your kid to a private daycare arrangement or stay home. You can send your kid to an independent school if you'd like, but how feasible is that choice? So I do think that the culture really matters, but the economic situation that is imposed on Canadians by government decisions is a really important factor here, and it's something that, when paired with the policy context around family and education policy, they really go hand in hand.
Exactly. Ginny, I think you've written really, really well, and you've done extremely good work on talking about the culture of raising families, and the pressures that are put on women to conform to a certain thing. And we see this. We see these cultural assumptions in all kinds of ways. You described it really well in your article at The Hub about needing to take a chill pill and so on. But those cultural assumptions actually are assumed by people making policy. Childcare is a classic example. I've referred to it as a policy made by lawyers for lawyers that totally ignores people who work at retirement homes or at Walmart or who have jobs elsewhere. If those cultural assumptions are embedded in places where those decisions are being made, how do you change that? Like, it is not simply a matter of saying, well, let's fix the culture, but there are real policy levers, really policy decisions in terms of who's making those policies. Yeah. How do you get at that so these policies can actually reflect the real needs of real women and real families in Canada?
Yeah. I mean, they say culture is downstream of politics, or politics is downstream of culture, rather, but politics and philosophy even embeds itself in political decision-making and impacts culture, there's no question. And I think, I'll call it liberal feminism. It's certainly big L liberal feminism, but it's also small L liberal feminism. And frankly, I think conservatives are guilty of it a lot, which people use the word gaslighting maybe too frequently these days, but it's kind of gaslighting to women. I mean, this idea that you can strip away all sex difference and design public policy based on a totally denatured conception of what a woman is, and that getting pregnant and giving birth and breastfeeding and raising children is just this sort of encumbrance that we can policy our way around is Awful, and I think when you see a liberal female response to that, often women who are politically involved on the liberal side, they have this cognitive dissonance where they want to defend this view of what equality is. But then when they experience it in their personal lives, I think you saw this a lot through COVID when women were sort of upset that they felt they had to pull back from the labor force and that their husbands didn't, women with young kids. I mean, a lot of these were young liberal women who couldn't understand why that was happening, or who maybe wanted to make that choice but were sort of uncomfortable with the choice that they were making. And it's because our policymakers tell us that the goal should be, the purpose of a woman is to be a GDP contributor, and that all public policy should be designed to maximize a woman's ability to contribute to GDP. And that's not at all consistent with what women want. Not just conservative women, I think the vast majority of just average apolitical women. And so, the childcare policy, I think, is the perfect example of this. Forget that it's designed for a very specific type of work. It's not designed to facilitate what a given family wants that's best for them, or that they choose in a sort of more pure way. It's designed to get women back into the workforce as quickly as possible and maximize the hours they contribute in the workplace. And men, for that matter. And if you have a parent who doesn't want to do that, first of all, yes, there's an economic challenge where you can't raise a family on one income anymore. That's like sort of unviable in our economy. But there's this other challenge where you can't access affordable childcare if that's the choice you want to make. And it does impede our choices. And then those choices impact our culture, and then our culture impact our politics. And it's sort of a vicious cycle. I mean, even the fact that people file taxes as individuals and don't think about how the government taxes them and how they relate to the government. They relate to the government as individuals, even though, for most people who are married, their family acts as a unit, and they make household expense decisions as a unit. And every time they interact with CRA, they're told that structure makes no sense.
Andrea,
Yeah, I mean, I can always add something. I sometimes feel like I act as unpaid promotions for Dr. Gordon Neufeld, who has written a book called Hold On to Your Kids, but he has added a chapter most recently to his book that reflects on COVID. And I haven't had it in hand yet, but apparently they talk about some families in COVID struggled. There was a rise in violence and other negative outcomes. But on the flip side, many families encounter the reality that it is nice to be near your kids. It is good to spend time with your children. And so I think that reality is the unacknowledged one. The cultural pressure pushing to be successful. You don't get awards or accolades for having kids. You get them for being top 30 under 30, top 40 under 40, whatever you've achieved in your career. And so I feel like that cultural pressure pushes in that direction, and then you have children, you realize, I do want to spend time with them, but you have not done anything prior to that point to build up your life to have a reality that reflects that. So there's groundwork that could be laid. That's the kind of thing we can't take for granted. We have to talk about it now, how to financially have a family, how to have real choices. Some women, a minority, want to work full-time. A majority want to work, I'm told via stats, they want to work part-time. That's my reality. And some women, also a minority, want to stay home full-time. If you want to have the real choice that you're able to make those, truly make that choice, you cannot decide it when you're, in labor and delivery. It needs to be, the groundwork needs to be laid to have that.
I also was doing email and labor and delivery. So don't be too hard on yourself.
It can take a while. You have some time. It's fair.
I was just trying to get over the sense of the wonder of this. I don't know how you guys are doing this. You're way better than me.
Crazy.
So, yeah, you guys are impressive. What is happening here is what I was thinking. So I want to follow up, and I actually want all three of you before we've got two more questions before we sort of run out of time. But what you're really talking about is, look, the economy, at least the way we understand it, and I think you guys would agree, is the economy is intended to serve the family. Right, you're working to sort of put bread on the table, right? Whether the idea is that the economy, your job, and so on, is intended to serve the family. And I think what you've pointed out is that our political leaders have often said, no, actually, we need the family to serve our end, GDP. We need more tax revenue, and you're going to work for us. How do you reverse that, but in a way that does not throw out what I think is the genuine progress? I'm going to use that press progress and the Progress Summit or whatever it's called is down the road. But I do think, you're all professional women. I've worked with you in professional environments. You're highly competent. You're smarter than me. You like to work. You enjoy work. I know that from all of you. You enjoy your work and you're good at it.
I have to say that because you are above me at Cardis.
Yeah.
I love my work.
I have no authority. Yeah. Thanks, Andrea. That's great. That's great. Thanks for exposing that. But I think that's a true statement.
True.
You guys are all very
True.
good at your work. You like it. It's not like you're working for the sake. So there's a vocational call. You obviously feel like you want to contribute to society in ways that are outside the home, and yet you've also made very clear statements about your desire to raise a family, to invest in your children. It seems to me that there's an imbalance currently between the state, and I would say not just the state, but corporate culture. I think it's strange, for instance, that we are subsidizing corporations, people to work at the corporation. Like, how do you find a balance? And what would a policy that actually provides balance between vocational calling of women in particular, but all people, I have a calling in vocation as well, and the desire to actually put food on the table, but with the fact that there is still space and freedom to raise a family and to do what frankly matters most, that your children do matter most. So maybe you can respond to that before.
So does anybody, I'm sure many people here follow Jonah Goldberg, and he's talked a lot about the English garden versus the French garden. The French garden having many manicured statued foliage, like just a lot of work goes into it to make exactly the thing you want to come out. And the English garden being till the soil and the plants grow as you'd like it to. So what's the relevance to the conversation on family? I think it's this, that it is a healthier environment to allow people, give them the environment they need to thrive, and then let the garden grow. That is both in the policy environment healthier, but also in your personal trying to raise your kids' environment healthier. So you have a safe environment for your kid, and otherwise you're not hovering, helicoptering over them, being super intense about your parenting. It's very clear to me that today we live in a policy environment where the designers are in full force, they see what they want, and they are calculating how to create the perfect citizen or child, and they give you a lot of, frankly, propaganda in that effort. So with $10 a day daycare, it's an economic policy, in my view, mostly to get more women working. But they dollop on many, many spoonfuls of how good it is for your child as well. And I contest that. We'll release a paper later this year about that. But it's that idea, we'll create that perfect child. They'll socialize perfectly. They have the early learning they need to get into grade 1, the right setup, et cetera. We need more balance, and we need more freedom to let the garden grow, whether it's my private family life or the public policy response.
I might push back a bit on that concept of balance or these two separate spheres, because it's very, if you believe there are two separate spheres, and the 1950s was sort of the worst version of what it meant to be a woman, and the sort of Friedman, you're stuck in the home, you don't get to use your brain, whatever. If you think of it as these two separate spheres, then you're going to want to deny the home sphere for women because that impedes their freedom to be their best selves or whatever. Pre-industrialization, all work was valued as work, and there was dignity in work, and much of work was in the home, and it might have been work caring for children, it might have been work doing laundry, it might have been work in a cottage industry selling wares that you make at home. And I'm not suggesting we go back to the pre-industrialized period, but I think if we can think of dignity in all kinds of work and the way we value all kinds of work in our policy design so that we aren't inadvertently devaluing work in the home done by men, women, moms, dads, help in the home, that we don't devalue that relative to real work in the economy. That, I think, is the better way to conceive of trying to find an equal footing between men and women who are different. And I think a purer way to think about policy design that doesn't make work evil and doesn't make home life evil, but actually sees the dignity in work in all spheres.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Yeah, I mean, it's really well put. I think there are ways that we can design policy to be a lot more flexible and to be a lot more supportive of different people's choices and not devalue work in the home. Or because I totally agree, Andrea, that the daycare policy is an economic policy. It's about getting women back into the labor force to increase women's labor force participation rates. That's an explicit goal, and it assumes that women prefer that, right, to go right back to work and to have daycare for their children. But again, when daycare costs $10 minus your taxes, and when you're getting paid more than that, then, well, that becomes a prescribed choice or something that it's more difficult to make the alternative choice for women. If you were to have a more flexible policy, instead of crafting this enormous government daycare scheme, they could have increased the Canada Child Benefit, right? We already have this payment to families. When you have children, you receive supports from the government to support those children, and that was a clean, simple way that a government who wanted to maximize choice and not devalue work in the home could have done that. Yeah. But they chose instead a prescriptive model of what women's lives should look like, which is that you should go back to work because you're empowered, and your children should spend most of their day with somebody else.
And even if you want to take a subsidiarity sort of approach, but say people should be able to pool their resources. Mm-hmm. I mean, the federal government's like the furthest possible institution away from people who and where their choices are. If a community wants to build a child care center through their church, or of course we should be able to pool resources to take care of kids. You can take care of multiple kids at once, and that can enable people to work in different part-time, full-time, but to do it from the federal government at a national level is just so flies in the face of trying to enable a sort of local bespoke choice for a given family or community.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one last point, the reason that you're answering emails from the labor and delivery room is because we are all privileged to have jobs where we love our work, right? Yeah. And that is something that policy also does not maximize flexibility for people who do. I've worked somewhat during every maternity leave that I've taken because I love my work, but I work unpaid when I'm on employment insurance because that is how the policy is structured. It's not flexible at all for women who want to have it all and do both.
Oh, well, and thanks for raising that too, because the laptop class is different. I think we have policy designed by a certain type of, call it liberal feminist, I don't know what, but they are also well-heeled, and they're not thinking at all about a woman working in retail. She's not working in labor and delivery because she has a whole different kind of job, right?
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely.
Exactly right. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I already know what's going to happen. We're going to hop on Twitter afterwards, and you guys are going to be CSFN has a bunch of reactionaries on the stage. Right? This is what's going to happen. I work for Cardis. We're so tired of it. It's not even new anymore. But that's the reality. That's the reality we're facing. It's you guys advocating for this sort of, I think, more nuanced and thoughtful and organic perspective of how to do policy. Okay, but let's forget about the Twitter hawks and ask yourself. You're now an ADM, or you're advising the next government, whoever it may be. How should we be framing policy around family? You've talked about lack of education or lack of freedom in terms of educational choice, educational pluralism. Places like Ontario, which is ostensibly a conservative government, has zero. Places like British Columbia, where there's an NDP government, has significant amounts. Why is this the case? So if you're advising the next round of leadership at the federal level, frame this topic for them. Say, if you're going to make policy around family, say, why does it matter? How should we think about it? Mm-hmm. And do that in 2 minutes each.
Well, first recognize that this does matter to people, and the stats that you've shared, that Andrea has shared around women wanting to have more children than they're having. We know from our own research at Fraser that independent school enrollment, despite the costs, is still increasing in every province. Homeschooling is growing in 9 out of 10 provinces. We know that families are still making private childcare arrangements for their children. People are making these choices despite it being extremely difficult and having to make enormous sacrifices to do so. So there is a political constituency, if I was advising a government, of people who care about this, and it's much larger than you think. And if you're going to design policy, just ensure that you're not being prescriptive. Just actually empower women and families with the ability to make the choices that they want to make, to choose the types of schools that they want to make, and maybe it's not going to craft the perfect citizen in the way that a government school does in your mind.
I will say, though, Cardis has research that shows, we actually have studied the outcomes of independent schooling, and it's fascinating. One of them was in Ontario, Ontario has a goal of the citizen they want to be. And what I found fascinating was that the independent schools actually met that target better than the public schools.
Well, there you go.
So I was just saying, if we want those citizens, let's do that. Sorry, I interrupted you, Paige.
No, exactly. I mean, just people making their own choices. We know the research on this. The social outcomes for kids will be better. The student success will be better from these kinds of policies that enable choice. So let families be successful.
You're here. Ginny?
Yeah, I won't repeat what Paige said. I think I would also just throw in, we're talking a lot about the stage at which people choose to have kids or not have kids or have more kids. But there are a couple steps that come before that. There have been a couple books written recently in the US on some of these issues, and one of them is on the importance of marriage. Before we know that kids raised in married families and families with both parents do better. And that choice often comes before. And even before that, people have to date successfully. I mean, it sounds very strange to talk about public policy in the context of dating. So maybe I'm just like egging on the Twitter people at this point. But I think we have to think about all those various stages of life from a very, very early in kids' lives when they're taught history and about the world and about their place in the world, all the way up to the point where they have thriving families. Every public policy consideration should be made through the frame of enabling the people organizing themselves in the way that we know is the most successful and drives the most happiness and the most thriving societies. And I don't think politicians should be shy about that. And I don't think it's opposed to the idea of freedom. If you want to make Canada the freest nation on earth, as our next speaker I'm sure will discuss, and which we're standing in the way of right now. Yeah. I think you have to bring that frame, and you have to frankly dismantle the choices that have been made in public policy at all levels of government that are maybe inadvertently, maybe not, blocking those choices today.
Thank you. Andrea?
I don't have a ton to add to that. It's already been said so eloquently. But I would say in other countries outside Canada, UK, USA, there's a lot of movement and momentum towards discussions of family as mattering in ways that are substantive and very important and just down to earth. Two-parent privilege, is that the book you were referring to? Or maybe yes, Brad Wilcox, Get Married, the UK authors. Yeah. I think Canada is falling a little bit behind in the sense of we're very hesitant to bring up family structure, marriage, as having any import at all into our economic, social climate. And it's deeply relevant, and I think the discussion, it's like I said at the start, now is not the time to take family for granted. And the politicians not just need to, but have effective language to allow just till the soil and let the choices happen. That I don't think you can keep family down, that easily. So it shouldn't be, in theory, too hard.
Yeah, and I actually think that as we've seen many times, the data actually back up all of this stuff. It's sort of seen as like being something that, it's just a religious commitment or something like that. No, actually the data back it up. You guys all do good work on that. You all pointed out. Ladies and gentlemen, can you please join me in thanking our reactionary panel? And I would encourage you to follow all of them on Twitter, follow them at their organizations. They're always great, always interesting, and thank you so much for your attention and your support here. Thanks so much.